The manor's night guard always noticed it first. A thin line of candlelight, glowing under a door that should have stayed dark. Every night, at the same hour, in the same room. The room belonged to a boy who was supposed to be dying. Servants whispered about it when they thought no one listened. A child with a body too weak to walk a full hallway without resting. A child cursed with cold that never left his bones. And yet, past midnight, when the whole manor slept, that light still burned. No one asked him why. No one thought he was worth asking. They assumed he sat awake because the cold kept him from resting. They assumed the shivering kept his eyes open. Nobody imagined that behind that door, night after night, he pushed his broken body through movements older than the family that now looked down on him. They had no idea what he really was. To understand the boy in that room, the story has to go back, not to his birth. Further than that, back to a life that ended in blood, in a place with no candlelight and no warmth at all. His name back then wasn't Rayon. He had no name that mattered. Only a title, the Blade. An assassin raised from childhood by a man he called Master, though the word never fit right in his mouth. Darius had taken a starving orphan and shaped him into a weapon, one blade among many, all built for a single purpose. Kill whoever Darius pointed at. Ask nothing. Feel nothing. For years, that was enough. A blank mind was safer than a curious one. Questions got assassins killed. Loyalty kept them alive, or so he believed. Right up until the night everything he trusted turned out to be a lie, built on top of another lie. The technique changed him first. Deep in the compound's forbidden archive, he found a manuscript describing a breathing method called the Ring of Fire. It wasn't meant for assassins. It was meant to build discipline in the mind, as much as the body, stage by stage, breath by breath. He trained it in secret, stealing hours meant for sleep. Slowly, something inside him woke up, that Darius had spent years trying to keep asleep. He started noticing things. The way Darius's eyes lingered too long after a mission. The way certain assassins vanished without explanation once they stopped being useful. The way loyalty in that compound only ever flowed one direction. For the first stretch of his life, none of it mattered enough to question. Then the Ring of Fire reached a stage that cleared the fog from his mind, and questions arrived all at once, sharp and impossible to ignore. He decided he wanted a life that belonged to him, not a grand rebellion, not a plan to escape into the night. Just a quiet hope that maybe, after one more year of service, Darius would let him walk away. Darius seemed to notice the change too, and instead of punishing it, he smiled. He called it growth. He praised the assassin's sharper eyes, his steadier hands, his sudden independence. He spoke of trust, of reward, of a future where the assassin could finally stand beside him instead of beneath him. For a few days, the assassin let himself believe it. Belief was the mistake. Years earlier, without his knowledge, Darius had planted something inside his body. A parasite, dormant and invisible, waiting for a single trigger. On the night Darius chose to reward his prized weapon, that trigger came. The assassin felt his own heart seize mid-breath. Darius didn't raise a blade. He didn't need to. He simply spoke calmly, while the parasite tore through muscle no sword could reach. The assassin lunged anyway. Rage carried his hand faster than pain could stop it, and his blade caught Darius's cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. It was the only wound he managed to land. It was also the last thing he ever did as that person. Darius didn't even flinch at the cut. He watched him fall with the same patient calm he used when discussing supply routes or coin. There had never been a plan to let him go. Every assassin came with fail-safes stacked on fail-safes, hidden loyalty devices meant to catch exactly this kind of awakening. His freedom had already been accounted for, long before he ever felt it. He died on cold stone, understanding at last that he had never once been trusted, not for a single day. Death didn't feel like an ending, though. It felt like falling through something that never hit bottom. Somewhere in that fall, a presence pressed against him, something ancient and starving, offering to fill the emptiness where his life used to be. He refused it on pure instinct, clinging instead to the one thing still fully his, the choice to refuse. Then came warmth, then came crying, not his own. He opened eyes that had never opened before, in a body far too small to hold the memories crammed inside it. A woman held him, her face wet with tears, her arms trembling, like she expected him to disappear if she let go. He didn't know her yet. He would learn her name soon enough. Sylvia. He had been born again, not as a nameless weapon, but as a newborn inside the Sieghart family, one of the most feared sword bloodlines on the continent. It should have felt like a gift. Sylvia's face told a different story. Her eyes carried a grief that had nothing to do with the joy of holding a newborn son. Something in her past clung to her like frost that never melted, and the baby in her arms understood, with unsettling clarity for someone only minutes old, that this family did not welcome them the way a family should. Word of the birth spread through the manor, with more scorn than celebration. Sylvia had once been a daughter of the Sieghart line herself, gifted with real talent, until love pulled her away from the family and into a marriage they never approved of. When tragedy took her husband and her daughter, she returned home with nothing left but grief, and a newborn son the family saw as a mistake, given a heartbeat. They called him a stain on the bloodline before he could even lift his own head. Glenn Sieghart, the family's head and Sylvia's father, allowed her back under his roof, but allowance wasn't the same as welcome. He was a mountain of a man, aura pressing off him even at rest, and his eyes carried none of the softness a grandfather's should. Whatever he felt about the boy, he buried it somewhere the boy couldn't reach. The rest of the household followed Glenn's example. Relatives spoke of the child only to mock him. Servants avoided his room out of habit rather than cruelty. Unsure what to do with a boy everyone expected to die young anyway. Only Sylvia looked at him like he mattered. She fed him herself instead of leaving it to nursemaids. She sang to him in a voice too tired to carry a tune properly, and he found himself listening anyway, letting the sound settle something inside his old, borrowed heart. A maid named Helen helped where she could, carrying blankets and warm water long after others had stopped bothering. Her quiet loyalty the only kindness in the house that asked for nothing in return. The boy who used to be an assassin decided, almost without meaning to, that he would protect this woman. Not because loyalty had ever done him any good before, because she had already given him something no one else ever had, care with no strings attached. His body, though, refused to cooperate with anything so noble. A curse ran through him, one the healers called the Frost Curse, chilling his blood and blocking the paths mana needed to travel. His skin stayed pale no matter how many blankets covered him. His limbs shook even in warm rooms. A physician who visited once shook his head and told Sylvia, gently but plainly, that children like this rarely live to see adulthood. Sylvia refused to accept that verdict. She searched for anyone who might help, eventually finding an eccentric healer known only as the Ragged Saint, a woman who cared more about results than reputation. The Ragged Saint examined the boy, muttered something about stubborn blood, and prescribed medicine that helped, if only barely. She also said something Glenn never forgot, though he pretended otherwise, that the boy's condition demanded more warmth from this family, not less. Glenn said nothing back, but somewhere behind his cold expression, doubt had already taken root. None of the adults in that house understood what the boy carried inside him. None of them could see the faint golden light that sometimes flickered behind his eyes when he remembered his old life, or the discipline of an assassin hiding inside a body barely able to sit upright. At night, when the manor fell silent, he pulled himself out of bed and began again what he had started in another life. The Ring of Fire. His first attempts were pitiful. His tiny lungs couldn't hold a full breath cycle. His frail arms shook trying to mimic stances his old body once performed without thought. He collapsed more nights than not, sweat freezing against his skin from the curse fighting back. He kept going anyway. Slowly, painfully, something began to shift. His breath steadied by a fraction. His grip found a hint of the old strength. Progress came in pieces too small for anyone but him to notice, and even he barely dared to hope it meant anything. Then, one night, a faint glowing window appeared in front of his eyes. No one else could see it. It listed numbers, categories, something that looked disturbingly like the systems the family's mana devices used, except this one answered only to him. Stats, traits, progress, in something labeled the Ring of Fire. It didn't explain itself completely. It didn't need to. He understood it instinctively, the way old habits return without thinking. This body kept score. This body rewarded effort. For the first time since dying, he had proof that his secret struggle actually meant something. He trained harder after that, hiding his exhaustion behind a mask of frailty during the day. Sylvia sometimes caught him swaying on his feet and assumed it was the curse. He let her believe it. Better she worry about sickness than notice the truth underneath. 2 years slipped by like that. Public weakness during daylight. Private war every night. The ring of fire crawled forward one stage at a time, each stage unlocking something new. Steadier focus, sturdier stamina, a growing awareness of the mana blocked inside him by the curse. Progress remained slow enough that outsiders saw nothing different. Inside, the boy who used to be an assassin felt himself waking piece by piece. Around this time, the family began preparing for something every Sieghart child eventually faced: the talent ceremony. A ritual meant to measure a child's mana purity, attribute, and future potential, using an ancient blade called the Sword of Justice. Relatives spoke about it constantly in the weeks leading up to it, mostly to remind Sylvia's son what he already suspected. Expectations for him sat somewhere below zero. Byrne, a cousin close to his age, made that clear at every opportunity. Arrogant, loud, thoroughly convinced of his own superiority, Byrne treated the ceremony as a formality that would finally prove what everyone already believed about the family's weakest branch. Luna, another young relative with real, recognized talent, showed no particular cruelty toward him, though her calm confidence only highlighted how far behind he was supposed to be. On the day of the ceremony, the great hall filled with more relatives than Sylvia's son had ever seen gathered in one place. Glenn stood at the front, his expression unreadable as always. One by one, children stepped forward, placed a hand on the Sword of Justice, and watched their results glow across its surface for everyone to see. Byrne's result drew polite approval. Luna's drew real excitement, whispers rippling through the crowd about her bright future. Then came his turn. He stepped forward on legs that still trembled from the curse, aware of every pair of eyes already expecting failure. He placed his palm against the blade's cold metal. Inside, something exploded. Golden light surged through his vision, so bright it felt like staring into a small sun. A presence brushed against his mind, ancient and vast, something that felt almost like the founder of this very bloodline, reaching across centuries to acknowledge him. Warmth flooded through his chest, entirely different from the curse's endless chill. Outside, none of that showed. The sword's surface flickered with a weak, pale glow, barely enough to register at all. Laughter broke out almost immediately. Relatives shook their heads, some pitying, most simply satisfied that their assumptions had been confirmed. Byrne didn't even bother hiding his smirk. Sylvia's face went pale, not from disappointment in her son, but from dread at what this result meant for both of them in a house that measured worth in mana alone. The boy said nothing. Inside, confusion mixed with something close to amusement. The sword had shown him more power in that private vision than most of the room would see in their entire lives. Yet the only thing anyone else witnessed was failure. The hall slowly emptied, relatives moving on to other business, already treating the outcome as settled. Only one person lingered. Glenn stayed behind after everyone left, staring at the sword with narrowed eyes. He said nothing to the boy directly. He simply watched as the blade, now alone, with no audience left to mislead, suddenly ignited with overwhelming golden flame, far brighter and far more violent than anything the earlier public display had shown. For one suspended moment, the old man's cold composure cracked. He didn't tell anyone what he saw. He didn't summon the boy back for questioning. He simply turned and walked away, leaving the training hall in silence, carrying a secret that would sit unspoken between grandfather and grandson for a long time to come. The boy never learned Glenn had seen anything at all. As far as he knew, his secret remained exactly that, a secret. Life at the manor continued afterward, with a fresh wave of insults aimed at Sylvia, relatives treating her son's failed ceremony as proof that her whole branch of the family deserved its low standing. Sylvia bore it quietly, the way she bore most things, though her son noticed the toll it took on her whenever she thought she was alone. That was the moment his private goals sharpened into something closer to a vow. Revenge against Darius still burned somewhere deep down, a debt he intended to collect eventually. But standing in that hallway, watching Sylvia force a smile through fresh humiliation, he decided something else mattered just as urgently. He would restore her name in this family, whatever it cost him. Training intensified after that. The Ring of Fire pushed into its third stage, each new level chipping away slightly more at the curse's grip. His stamina grew, quietly, invisibly, a private fortune building behind a mask of sickness. Then, one night, something new arrived to test him. He had been meditating, focused entirely on breath and control, when a pressure unlike anything human settled over the room. A voice slithered into his thoughts, calm and hungry at once, introducing itself as a demon lord, bound to whatever rage had followed him from his old life into this one. The rage spirit offered him strength, real strength, immediate and overwhelming, enough to burn through every obstacle standing between him and Darius. All it wanted in exchange was his body, just for a while, just enough to taste freedom again. Something in him wanted to say yes. The temptation came from an honest place, exhaustion, old fury, the desperate wish to skip every slow step ahead of him and simply become powerful enough to end things now. He refused anyway. The refusal came at a cost. The rage spirit didn't simply fade away disappointed. It fought for control, clawing at the edges of his mind with an intensity that left him gasping on the floor of his room, sweat mixing with the frost curse's chill in a way that made his skin feel like it was cracking apart. For a long, terrifying stretch, he wasn't entirely sure he would win. He held on through sheer stubbornness, the same stubbornness that once kept him alive through years of brutal assassin training. Slowly, the pressure eased. The spirit, unable to force its way in, settled instead into a bracelet that wrapped itself around his wrist. Dormant, but never silent, always ready to whisper temptation again, given the right moment of weakness. He wore that bracelet from then on, a constant reminder of power he refused to accept on someone else's terms. Not long after, the family announced it was time for formal training to begin. Every Sieghart child eventually entered one of the family's training halls, ranked from weakest to strongest, and everyone already assumed which one waited for Sylvia's son. The fifth hall, the lowest. The place reserved for those the family considered barely worth teaching at all. Before he left for it, another cruel comment aimed at Sylvia reached his ears, this time from a relative who clearly intended for him to hear it too. Something old and controlled snapped quietly inside him, replaced by calm, focused resolve. Glenn tested him once more before letting him go, watching closely as the boy accepted a brutal, half-starved image of what training in the fifth hall would mean. No complaints left his mouth. No hesitation touched his eyes. He simply agreed to endure whatever came, provided it eventually led somewhere Sylvia could finally hold her head up in this house. Whatever Glenn saw in that answer, he kept to himself, the same way he'd kept the burning sword to himself. But something in his stance, just barely, softened. The fifth training hall turned out to be exactly as harsh as its reputation promised. Cold stone floors, minimal instruction, and other students who had long since decided that ranking near the bottom meant they belonged there together, bonded by shared resentment toward anyone who might threaten their place. Sylvia's son ranked lowest of them all on arrival, at least as far as any of them could tell. He said little, watched everything, and waited. The hall's instructor, a sharp-eyed man named Rimmer, ran the first major test without much ceremony, a punishing endurance run meant to separate students who could handle real training from those who couldn't. Most expected the sickly newcomer to drop out within the first stretch. He didn't. Stronger students began faltering long before he did, their confidence cracking as their legs gave out under a pace they'd underestimated. He kept moving long after that, breath ragged, curse burning cold through every step, driven by something none of them could see or measure. By the time the run ended, he was still on his feet, barely, but undeniably. Rimmer didn't say much afterward, but his eyes lingered on the boy a little longer than necessary, the way someone looks at a puzzle piece that doesn't fit the picture they'd already assumed. A faint golden shimmer crossed the edge of Sylvia's son's vision. Another reward, unseen by anyone but him, another small piece of the system quietly acknowledging what his effort had earned. Other students noticed the outcome differently. If the weakest boy in the hall could outlast half the group, something about that didn't sit right with them. Whispers started almost immediately, ugly and predictable, accusations that he must have cheated somehow, that no cursed, frail nobody could possibly out-endure students who'd trained for this their whole lives. That night, a group of them cornered him outside the dormitory, faces set with the particular confidence of people convinced they were about to teach someone a lesson. He recognized the posture immediately. Untrained anger, dressed up as intimidation. In his old life, he'd faced far worse before breakfast. They came at him together, expecting numbers to make up for skill. It didn't take long for that assumption to fall apart. His body might have been weak by noble standards, but his instincts belonged to someone who'd survived real fights, meant to kill, not schoolyard posturing meant to humiliate. He moved efficiently, redirected their momentum against itself, and left the group scattered across the ground before any of them fully understood what happened. None of it required brute strength. Every motion carried the quiet economy of someone who'd once made a living, doing far worse to far more dangerous opponents. Standing over them, breathing hard but steady, he felt something close to grim satisfaction. Whatever they thought they knew about the weakest boy in the fifth hall, it was already wrong, and they were only beginning to find that out. Behind his ribs, the golden system window flickered again, tallying another reward for the encounter. Progress, quiet and steady, continuing to build beneath a reputation that still hadn't caught up to reality. That same night, as he sat alone afterward, letting his breathing settle, the bracelet on his wrist grew warm. The rage spirit stirred, its voice returning with an edge of amusement this time instead of hunger. It proposed something new. A wager, it called it, tied to how far his training would carry him from here, framed just casually enough to sound harmless, and just deliberately enough to promise it wasn't. He didn't answer right away. Whatever the spirit was offering, he understood by now that nothing from it came free. The wager sat there, unanswered, hanging in the space between his ribs and his skin. He'd learned enough about deals with things like this to know that silence was its own kind of answer, and the spirit didn't push. It simply waited, the warmth in the bracelet fading back to nothing, patient in a way that unsettled him more than any threat would have. He decided not to think about it that night. Tomorrow would bring its own problems. Tomorrow arrived faster than he expected. News of the ambush spread through the fifth hall before breakfast ended. 3 students showing up with bruises they couldn't explain convincingly, all of them suddenly quiet whenever his name came up. The story didn't need him to tell it. The evidence walked around wearing it on their faces. Rimmer heard the whispers too. He said nothing to the group directly, but during morning drills, his gaze kept drifting toward the boy everyone still assumed belonged at the bottom of the roster. There was a difference between watching someone fail and watching someone you'd misjudged, and Rimmer's expression had started to shift from one into the other. Byrne caught wind of it by midday, and predictably, he didn't believe a word. Group of trainees, beaten by the frost-cursed reject? He said to anyone nearby, loud enough to make sure it reached its target. Sounds like an excuse for losing to each other. Sylvia's son said nothing back. Arguing with Byrne had never been worth the breath. Let him believe whatever made his mornings easier. Reality would catch up eventually, the same way it always did with people who built their confidence on assumptions instead of evidence. Luna, watching the exchange from a short distance, didn't join in. She studied him instead, quietly, the way someone studies a math problem that refuses to add up the expected way. She didn't say anything either, but her eyes lingered a moment too long to be simple disinterest. He filed that away. Luna paid attention. That made her either useful or dangerous, and it was too early to know which. Training resumed that afternoon with a new drill, something meant to test control rather than pure endurance. Students were paired off to practice channeling small amounts of aura through basic strikes, a skill most of them had been building since childhood under proper tutors. He'd had none of that here, not openly. Everything he knew, he'd rebuilt alone at night, piece by piece, borrowed from a life nobody in this hall would ever believe he'd lived. Rimmer paired him with one of the 3 students from the previous night's ambush, a stocky boy named Fane, who still carried a fading bruise along his jaw. The pairing wasn't an accident. Instructors rarely did anything by accident, and Rimmer's eyes carried a flicker of something close to curiosity as he announced it. Fane's posture stiffened the moment he heard the assignment. Old anger flashed across his face, quickly buried under practiced discipline, the kind drilled into every noble child before they learned to walk properly. They squared off. Fine struck first. A clumsy show of aggression meant more to intimidate than to actually connect. Sylvia's son sidestepped without much effort, letting the strike pass by close enough to feel the air shift, then returned a controlled tap to Fine's shoulder that carried no real force at all. A message, not an injury. Fine's face went red. He came again. Sloppier this time, anger overriding whatever technique he'd actually trained. Sylvia's son caught his wrist mid-swing, redirected the momentum, and let Fine stumble past him into open air, catching himself just before hitting the ground. Laughter rippled through a few nearby students, quickly stifled once they remembered whose side they were supposed to be on. Rimmer called the drill to a stop before it escalated further, his expression unreadable, but his attention fully locked onto the smaller boy who'd just made a losing position look effortless twice in a row. Again, Rimmer said, different partner. He rotated through 2 more students that session, each match ending the same quiet way. No dramatic finishing blows, no showmanship, just precise, economical movement that left his opponents off balance and increasingly uneasy. By the end of the session, the whispers around the fifth hall had changed shape entirely. Less mockery, more confusion, edged with something that hadn't existed there before: caution. That evening, Rimmer approached him directly for the first time since he'd arrived. The instructor didn't ask about his technique outright. Instead, he asked where he'd learned to move like that, phrasing the question carefully, like a man testing ice before stepping onto it. Sylvia's son considered his answer for a moment. He couldn't tell the truth, obviously. He couldn't say a past life spent killing for a man who eventually murdered him had taught his hands more about violence than any noble tutor ever could. Instead, he gave a version close enough to honest to hold up: instinct, desperation, and a body that had learned early that weakness invited attacks it couldn't survive any other way. Rimmer studied him a long moment before nodding slowly, accepting the answer without fully believing every word of it. Instinct like that doesn't usually come from nothing, he said. Then, without further explanation, he walked off, leaving the boy standing there wondering exactly how much the instructor suspected. It wouldn't be the last time someone looked at him a beat too long. That night, alone in his room, he returned to training with the Ring of Fire, pushing through the breathing forms with the same discipline that had carried him this far. His limbs still ached from the curse's constant chill, but less than they used to. Small, steady progress, invisible to anyone but the glowing window only he could see. The window flickered again partway through his practice, offering a fresh notification. His endurance stat had ticked upward. His control had improved by a fraction large enough to notice, small enough that no one watching him during the day would suspect anything had changed at all. He sat back against the cold wall afterward, catching his breath, staring at nothing in particular. The bracelet on his wrist grew warm again. This time, the rage spirit didn't wait to be invited. Its voice slid into his thoughts with the same lazy confidence as before, circling back to the wager it had proposed the previous night. The terms, once it finally laid them out plainly, were simple enough to unsettle him more than complicated ones would have. The spirit wanted him to keep training exactly as he had been. No shortcuts, no help from it. If, by a certain point in his growth, he still hadn't reached power enough to satisfy some measure the spirit refused to fully explain, it would earn the right to whisper louder, closer, more often. And if he did reach that measure on his own, the spirit's tone shifted just slightly, something almost like respect buried under its usual hunger. Then it would owe him something instead. It didn't specify what. He turned the offer over carefully, aware that agreeing to anything with a being like this rarely ended in his favor. But refusing outright meant the spirit would simply keep pressing anyway, uninvited, testing his walls whenever exhaustion or pain gave it an opening. Better to know the terms of a fight already happening than to pretend it wasn't. He agreed, cautiously, silently promising himself he'd find the edges of this wager the same way he found the edges of everything else, by testing them carefully, one step at a time, never fully trusting what he couldn't verify. The spirit's presence faded again, satisfied for now, leaving him alone with his thoughts, and the quiet hum of the Ring of Fire still settling in his chest. Sleep came harder than usual that night. Not from fear exactly, from the sense that he'd just added another clock ticking somewhere he couldn't see, counting down toward a deadline with stakes he still didn't fully understand. Morning brought fresh demands regardless. The fifth hall's routine tightened as the days passed, drills growing longer, expectations climbing even for students the family had already written off. Rimmer pushed harder on the ones showing unexpected promise, and whether he intended it publicly or not, Sylvia's son found himself receiving more attention than students ranked well above him. That attention came with a cost. Byrne noticed it too, and jealousy didn't sit quietly on someone like him. He started needling at every opportunity. Small comments meant to undercut whatever ground the boy he despised had started gaining. Most of it rolled off without effect. Sylvia's son had survived worse than a spoiled cousin's wounded pride. What did land, every time, was any comment aimed at Sylvia herself. Byrne seemed to sense that too, the way bullies often sensed exactly where a person's armor had gaps. He brought her up more than once, framing his cruelty as concern for the family's reputation, dressing insults up as observations everyone else was supposedly too polite to say aloud. Each time, Sylvia's son felt the same old heat rise behind his ribs, controlled now, bank down under years of discipline that predated this entire body. He didn't retaliate with words. He simply reminded himself, quietly, of the promise he'd made in that hallway after the talent ceremony. Her name would not stay stained. Not because of him. Not because of anyone else in this house either. Word of Sylvia's difficulties reached her occasionally too, filtered through servants who meant well, but couldn't always keep unpleasant gossip from finding its way back to her ears. She never confronted him about it directly, never asked what he heard or how it made him feel. She simply held him a little tighter some evenings, humming that same tuneless song, as if physical closeness could shield him from things words already couldn't undo. He let her believe the comfort flowed only one direction. In truth, those evenings did as much for him as they ever did for her. Weeks passed like that, training by day, secrets by night, small victories accumulating in a place only he could measure. His body grew marginally stronger. His control over the little mana the curse allowed through grew sharper. The system window logged every gain quietly, patiently, building towards something even he couldn't yet name. Then came the day everything shifted again. Subtly at first, the way most important changes in his life seemed to start. The fifth hall received notice that a senior instructor, someone well above Rimmer's rank, planned to observe a coming evaluation. Word spread that evaluations like this occasionally decided which students might eventually transfer into better-ranked halls, a rare opportunity for anyone stuck at the bottom to prove their placement wrong. Students who normally ignored each other suddenly grew competitive, sensing an opening most had assumed didn't exist for people like them. Byrne treated the news as a formality confirming his inevitable rise elsewhere. Luna said little, though her focus sharpened noticeably during drills that followed, each movement crisper than before. Sylvia's son kept his expression carefully neutral, giving away nothing about what this evaluation might mean for him specifically. Inside, though, something steadied. An opportunity like this, however small, was exactly the kind of foothold he needed if he ever intended to climb high enough to matter in a family that measured worth purely in results. Rimmer pulled him aside briefly before the day of evaluation arrived, his tone quieter than usual, almost cautious. "Whatever you're hiding," Rimmer said, not unkindly, "you'll want to show at least some of it tomorrow. Sandbagging won't help you here." Sylvia's son said nothing in response beyond a small nod, careful not to confirm or deny anything the instructor half-suspected already. Rimmer studied him another beat, then let the matter drop, walking away with the particular patience of someone content to wait for proof, rather than force a confession. That night, training alone in his room, he pushed the ring of fire harder than he had in weeks, chasing whatever fraction of progress he could squeeze out before morning. Sweat mixed with the curse's chill along his spine, muscles trembling with effort long after his lungs begged him to stop. The system window flared once more near the end of his practice, delivering news that made him pause mid-breath. Stage 3 of the Ring of Fire complete. He sat with that for a long moment, feeling the shift settle through his chest, like something clicking properly into place for the first time. The curse still lingered, stubborn and cold, but its grip had loosened just slightly further, mana flowing a touch more freely than it had even a week earlier. Whatever tomorrow's evaluation brought, he intended to walk into it carrying more than anyone in that hall currently expected from him. Morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of sharp, cloudless day that made the Manor's training grounds look almost peaceful, if you ignored the tension radiating from every student lined up along its edge. The senior instructor arrived precisely on time, flanked by 2 attendants, his expression carrying the same practiced neutrality Sylvia's son had come to recognize among the family's higher-ranking members. Introductions were brief, explanations, briefer still. The evaluation, it turned out, wouldn't test endurance or basic sparring this time. It would test something closer to raw output, each student asked to channel whatever aura or mana control they possessed, directly into a measuring formation, embedded in the training ground's stone floor, a device similar in principle to the Sword of Justice, though far less legendary in scope. Byrne went early, producing a respectable surge that drew polite nods from the observing instructor. Luna followed shortly after, her output notably stronger, earning a longer pause of genuine consideration from the man evaluating them. Then came the names further down the roster, students ranked lower, results ranging from modest to unremarkable, exactly what the Fifth Hall's reputation predicted. Sylvia's son waited near the back, watching each result carefully, calculating exactly how much he could safely reveal without drawing suspicion he wasn't ready to handle. Too weak, and nothing changed. Too strong, and questions would follow that he had no good answers for yet. When his turn finally came, he stepped forward onto the formation, aware of Rimmer watching closely from the sideline, aware of Burns' smirk, already forming in anticipation of another humiliation to enjoy. He closed his eyes briefly, drawing on the Ring of Fire's third stage, carefully metering exactly how much he let through the formation's measuring array. Just enough to surprise. Not nearly enough to expose everything simmering beneath the surface. The formation lit up, brighter than anyone expected from him, dimmer than what he actually held in reserve. Murmurs spread immediately through the gathered students. The senior instructor's brow lifted slightly, his earlier disinterest replaced by something closer to genuine attention. Rimmer's expression didn't change much, though his eyes carried a flicker of quiet vindication, like a man watching a hunch finally pay off in front of witnesses. Burns' smirk faltered, confusion briefly cracking through his usual arrogance before he forced it back down. The senior instructor made a note, said little beyond a brief acknowledgement, and moved on to the next student. No dramatic announcement followed, no immediate promise of transfer to a better hall. Just a small, measured mark in whatever ledger decided such things. A mark that hadn't existed for Sylvia's son before today. It wasn't victory, not fully, but it was progress. Visible progress. The kind that couldn't be dismissed quite as easily as the family had dismissed his talent ceremony. Word of the evaluation spread through the manor faster than he expected, distorted slightly with each retelling, the way rumors always were. By evening, even Sylvia had heard some version of it. Her expression when she found him afterward, caught somewhere between disbelief and cautious hope. She didn't ask him directly how he'd managed it. She simply held his face in both hands for a moment, studying him like she was seeing something new, something she hadn't quite let herself hope for since the day of his failed ceremony. "Whatever you're doing," she said softly, "keep doing it." He almost told her everything then, the training, the system, the memories that didn't belong to a child his age. The words rose in his throat and stopped there, held back by the same old instinct that had kept him alive through years of secrets in another life entirely. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But someday, if things went the way he intended, she would understand exactly why her son had never been quite what this family assumed. That night, alone again, the bracelet on his wrist warmed once more, the rage spirit's voice returning with something almost like approval threaded through its usual hunger. Progress noted, it said simply, before falling silent again, leaving him to wonder exactly how closely it had been watching, and exactly what shape its patience might take once their wager's deadline finally arrived. He didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time since waking up in this fragile, cursed little body, he allowed himself to believe the climb ahead, however long, however brutal, was one he could actually survive. The mark from the evaluation traveled further than Sylvia's son expected. Within the household, information rarely stayed contained to servants' gossip alone. It found its way, eventually, to the ears of relatives who preferred not to think about Sylvia's branch of the family at all. His aunt, a sharp-tongued woman named Yulia, who had never bothered hiding her disdain for Sylvia's marriage, or its aftermath, brought it up at dinner one evening, with the particular relish of someone eager to dismiss good news before it could take root. "A single decent showing means nothing," she said, cutting into her meal without looking up. "The boy failed his ceremony in front of the whole family. One lucky evaluation doesn't erase that." Glenn, seated at the head of the table, said nothing. His silence carried weight in that house, more weight than most people's words, and Yulia's confidence faltered slightly under it, before she recovered and changed the subject. Sylvia's son, seated further down the table where the lesser branches of the family were expected to sit, kept his eyes on his food and said nothing either. He'd learned patience the hard way. In a life where reacting to provocation got assassins killed faster than any enemy blade, waiting cost him nothing here. Reacting might cost him everything he'd built so quietly. Glenn's silence, though, wasn't indifference. It hadn't been indifference for a while now, not since the night he'd stood alone in front of a sword that erupted into golden fire the moment everyone else left the room. He'd told no one what he'd seen. He'd asked no one to explain it, but he'd started watching his grandson more carefully than he let on, gathering small pieces of information, the way a man accustomed to strategy gathered anything useful, quietly, patiently, without tipping his hand before he understood the full shape of what he was looking at. He'd heard about the evaluation from Rimmer directly, the instructor's report more detailed than the version that had reached the dinner table. Rimmer hadn't exaggerated. If anything, His account undersold what he'd witnessed, cautious phrasing chosen by a man who suspected more than he could yet prove. Glenn read the report twice that night, alone in his study, the same room where he kept records on every notable talent to pass through the Sieghart training halls in the last 3 decades. He set the report down eventually, staring at nothing in particular, turning over a memory he'd been trying not to think about too directly. Golden flame, vast and sudden, gone the instant anyone else might have seen it. He didn't believe in coincidence. Not in a family built on bloodline and inheritance, where power tended to run in patterns even when it skipped a generation or hid itself behind unremarkable results. Somewhere beneath his careful neutrality, an old, half-buried hope stirred, one he didn't dare name yet, not even to himself. He decided to wait. Watching costs nothing. Hoping too loudly, in a family like his, often did. Meanwhile, life in the 5th training hall shifted in smaller, more immediate ways. Word of the evaluation's outcome had reached the other students too, and while nothing official changed about the hall's rankings yet, the atmosphere around Sylvia's son had noticeably cooled from open contempt into something more guarded. Fine, still nursing wounded pride from their earlier sparring match, kept his distance now, choosing silence over further confrontation. The other 2 students from that first ambush followed his lead, apparently deciding that whatever the frost-cursed reject had turned out to be, provoking him twice wasn't worth the risk. Byrne remained the exception. If anything, the evaluation's results seemed to sharpen his hostility rather than dull it, jealousy curdling into something closer to obsession. He couldn't openly challenge the outcome without looking petty in front of instructors who'd witnessed it directly, so his cruelty shifted instead into smaller, meaner channels. Comments dropped just quietly enough to avoid consequence, aimed with increasing precision at Sylvia rather than her son. Sylvia's son noticed the shift immediately. He'd spent years reading intent behind carefully chosen words, a skill honed originally for a very different kind of survival. Byrne's new strategy was obvious enough. Attack where it actually hurt, since attacking the boy directly had stopped working. He let it continue for a while, unwilling to escalate without cause, unwilling to give Byrne the satisfaction of an obvious reaction. But patience, however deep, still had a floor. The breaking point came roughly a week later, during a rare open gathering where students from multiple halls crossed paths, a loosely supervised social hour the family arranged periodically to maintain some appearance of unity among its scattered branches. Byrne found him near the edge of the gathering, flanked by 2 other students eager to bask in his confidence. His comment that day wasn't subtle at all, delivered loud enough to guarantee an audience, framing Sylvia's return to the family as a burden the household had been forced to absorb out of obligation rather than love. Something in Sylvia's son went very still. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move aggressively. He simply stepped closer, close enough that Byrne's confident posture faltered slightly under the sudden focused attention. "Say that again," he said quietly. Not a threat exactly. Something colder than a threat. A simple invitation, offered with the calm certainty of someone who no longer needed volume to make a point land. Byrne hesitated, some old survival instinct flickering behind his arrogance. Some part of him remembering exactly what had happened to the last group of students who'd underestimated the boy standing in front of him now. He didn't repeat the comment. He backed down instead, muttering something about not wasting his breath, retreating with his companions in a manner that fooled no one watching. The retreat itself became its own kind of statement, more damaging to Byrne's reputation than any physical confrontation would have been. Luna, standing nearby with her usual quiet composure, watched the entire exchange without comment. Her expression, though, carried something new. Not surprise exactly. Recognition, maybe. The sense of watching a piece finally settle into a shape she'd suspected for a while, but hadn't confirmed until now. She approached him afterward, briefly, her tone measured and careful. "You could have hit him," she said. "You didn't. Wasn't worth it," he answered simply. She studied him a moment longer, something calculating behind her eyes, though not unkindly so. "Careful," she said eventually. "People who hold back that much usually have a reason." Then she walked away, leaving him to wonder exactly how much she'd already guessed, and exactly how dangerous that guessing might become if it reached the wrong ears before he was ready. That evening, back in the 5th Hall's quarters, Rimmer called him aside once more, this time with a tone carrying less caution and more direct interest than before. "You handled that well," Rimmer said, referring to the gathering. Word of the confrontation apparently having reached him already through channels Sylvia's son hadn't anticipated. Better than most trained fighters twice your age would have. Sylvia's son said nothing, waiting to see where the instructor intended to take the conversation. Rimmer studied him a long moment, then continued, choosing his next words with obvious care. I've trained students in this hall for 6 years. I've seen talent hidden under bad circumstances before. I've never seen anything quite like you. It wasn't quite an accusation. It wasn't quite praise either. It sat somewhere in between. An instructor's honest assessment, delivered without any attempt to dress it up as flattery. Whatever you're protecting, Rimmer added, I won't push you to explain it before you're ready. But eventually, hiding this much talent will cost you more than revealing it would. The warning lingered with him long after Rimmer walked away. He understood the truth in it, even as he recognized the risk. A secret buried too deep eventually became its own kind of trap, especially in a family that measured everything by results, where sustained excellence without explanation would only breed the exact kind of suspicion he'd been trying to avoid. He wasn't ready to reveal everything, not yet. But Rimmer's words planted a seed of urgency that hadn't quite existed before, a recognition that his current strategy of careful concealment had a shelf life, however long that shelf life might turn out to be. That night, training alone as usual, he found himself pushing the Ring of Fire's 4th stage harder than caution probably recommended. His body still carried the curse's chill, still trembled under strain that would have been nothing at all to his old assassin body, but the gap between what he could endure now and what he'd been capable of just weeks earlier kept narrowing, in ways that felt almost startling when he stopped to measure it honestly. The system window flickered partway through his session, delivering a notification that made him pause mid-breath for the second time in recent memory. A new trait had unlocked, something the window labeled, plainly and without embellishment, as Assassin's Instinct, a passive enhancement to reflexes and situational awareness, drawn directly from muscle memory his old life had built through years of genuine mortal danger. He sat with that discovery for a long moment, turning the implications over carefully. His old skills weren't just memories anymore, locked away as knowledge without physical form. They were becoming part of this body's actual capability, integrating slowly into the flesh and bone he'd been born into this time around. The bracelet on his wrist warmed as it often did during quiet moments like this, the rage spirit's presence stirring without quite manifesting fully. You're moving faster than the wager accounted for, it said. Something almost like genuine surprise threaded through its usual smugness. He didn't respond immediately, considering the observation carefully, before finally speaking aloud, his voice barely above a whisper in the dark room. Good, he said. Means you'll owe me sooner. The spirit's presence went quiet after that, retreating without further comment, though something in its silence felt different than before. Less predatory, more thoughtful, as if it were genuinely reconsidering the terms of a bet it had assumed was safely in its favor. Days folded into weeks after that, each one carrying its own small accumulation of progress. Training sharpened. The curse loosened its grip by degrees too slow for anyone but him to properly measure. The system window kept its quiet tally, stat by stat, trait by trait, building towards some larger threshold he still couldn't fully see the shape of yet. Sylvia noticed the changes too, though she attributed them to simple growth rather than anything more extraordinary. She commented once, gently, that he seemed to stand a little straighter these days, his color a shade less pale than it used to be during the worst of winter's cold snaps. He told her it was probably the medicine from the Ragged Saint finally taking hold properly, and she accepted the explanation without pushing further, relief evident in the way her shoulders relaxed slightly whenever she looked at him now. He hated lying to her, even by omission, but some truths, revealed too early, only invited danger neither of them could afford yet. Better she believe in medicine and good fortune a while longer than understand the full weight of what her son actually carried inside him. The fifth hall's dynamic continued shifting too, subtly but unmistakably. Fewer students dismissed him openly now. More watched him carefully instead, uncertain how to categorize someone who refused to fit the expectations his ranking and reputation had assigned him from the start. Burns' hostility simmered rather than boiled over again, restrained now by the memory of backing down in front of an audience, though restraint didn't mean the resentment had faded. If anything, it seemed to deepen, curdling into something patient and calculating that worried Sylvia's son more than open aggression ever had. Loud enemies telegraphed their intentions. Quiet ones waited for the right moment. He kept that concern filed away alongside everything else he was tracking. Glenn's unexplained attention, Rimmer's growing suspicion, Luna's careful observation, the rage spirit's shifting wager, the slow unraveling of a curse that had once been expected to kill him before he ever reached adolescence. Every piece of this puzzle was moving. He intended to make sure, whatever direction it eventually moved toward, that he'd be strong enough to shape the outcome himself, rather than simply survive whatever came next. Then, roughly a month after the evaluation, everything accelerated at once. It started with a formal announcement delivered to the fifth hall by one of Glenn's personal attendants, an unusual occurrence in itself, given how rarely the family head's household staff bothered communicating directly with the lowest-ranked training group. The announcement was brief, almost clinical in its phrasing. Select students from across all 5 halls would be evaluated together in an upcoming trial, results to be reviewed personally by Glenn himself. The hall buzzed with tension the moment the attendant left. An evaluation reviewed directly by the family head hadn't happened in years, according to older students who remembered the last occurrence. Whatever prompted this sudden interest, it clearly mattered enough to break with years of established routine. Rimmer's expression, when Sylvia's son caught sight of it later that day, carried a rare flicker of genuine surprise, quickly smoothed over into professional composure. Whatever the instructor knew about why this evaluation had suddenly materialized, he wasn't sharing it yet, though his eyes drifted towards Sylvia's son more than once during the following hours, calculating something he kept carefully to himself. Sylvia's son turned the timing over in his mind that night, alone in his room, breathing through another ring of fire cycle, while his thoughts worked through the implications. Glenn rarely did anything without deliberate purpose. An unprecedented evaluation, arriving so soon after his own quiet display of hidden strength, felt too coincidental to actually be coincidence. Somewhere in that cold, calculating mind behind Glenn's permanently unreadable expression, something had shifted. Whether that shift worked in his favor or against him remained an open question, one he wouldn't be able to answer until the evaluation actually arrived. The bracelet on his wrist warmed again as he finished his session, the rage spirit's voice returning with unusual quiet, almost contemplative compared to its earlier tone. "This is where it starts moving faster," it said simply. "Whatever you've been building toward, the family's about to notice all at once instead of piece by piece." He didn't argue with the assessment. Some part of him had suspected the same thing, building for weeks now, the way pressure builds ahead of a storm, long before the first drop of rain actually falls. Whatever came next, in the days leading up to that evaluation, he intended to be ready for it. Not perfectly ready, not fully revealed, but ready enough that when the moment finally arrived to show this family exactly what they'd dismissed so easily, they wouldn't be able to look away and pretend they hadn't seen it clearly. Sylvia deserved that moment. So did the boy he used to be, murdered by a man who'd never once seen him as anything more than a tool. The path toward both was getting shorter now. He could feel it, the way he used to feel a mission tightening toward its final, decisive moment, back when his hands had belonged to someone else entirely. Whatever the coming evaluation revealed, whatever Glenn had already started to suspect, whatever the rage spirit's wager ultimately demanded of him, one thing had become clear beyond doubt. The weakest boy in the 5th training hall was no longer quite so easy to underestimate, and soon, very soon, the rest of this family would have no choice but to notice exactly what they'd been looking at all along. The morning of the evaluation arrived colder than usual, frost clinging to the training ground's stone in patterns that mirrored the curse still living under his skin. Students from all 5 halls gathered at once, a rare sight, uniforms marking rank in ways that made the divisions between them impossible to ignore. 5th hall students clustered near the back, as expected. 1st and 2nd hall students stood near the front, postures relaxed with the particular confidence of people who'd never once doubted their place in this family. Sylvia's son stood among his own group, saying little, watching everything. Burns stood a short distance away, tension visible in his shoulders despite his attempts to appear unaffected. Whatever confidence he'd carried before had thinned considerably since the last gathering. Glenn arrived without fanfare, simply appearing at the edge of the training ground flanked by 2 attendants, his presence enough to silence every conversation happening at once. He said nothing initially, his eyes sweeping across the assembled students with the same unreadable calm he carried everywhere. Rimmer stood near the 5th hall group, his own posture carrying a tension Sylvia's son hadn't seen from him before. Whatever role the instructor suspected he might play today, it clearly weighed on him more than he let show. The evaluation format, once explained, turned out to be simpler than the rumors had suggested. Each student would face a single measured exercise, channeling aura and mana together, through a basic strike against a testing pillar, embedded with the same kind of formation used in the Fifth Hall's earlier evaluation, except this version, everyone understood without being told, would report its results directly to Glenn, rather than some mid-ranked observer. Students went in order of hall ranking, highest first. First hall students produced results that drew murmurs of appropriate respect. Second and third hall students followed, results tapering downward in a pattern that matched expectations closely enough to bore most of the crowd. By the time attention reached the fourth and fifth halls, the audience had settled into the kind of polite disinterest reserved for outcomes everyone assumed were already decided. Byrne went before him, producing a result slightly better than his earlier showing, enough to earn a small nod from Glenn but nothing more. He retreated to his group with visible relief, some of his old confidence returning now that his own test had ended without embarrassment. Then came the name Sylvia's son had been waiting for. He stepped forward, aware of every eye that had drifted back toward attentiveness now that the family head himself watched directly. Rimmer's gaze followed him closely. Glenn's expression remained utterly unreadable, though something in the stillness of his posture suggested he was paying closer attention than his face let on. Sylvia's son closed his eyes briefly, drawing on everything the Ring of Fire's fourth stage had built inside him over the past month. This time, he decided, holding back would cost more than it protected. Rimmer's warning echoed in his thoughts. Secrets buried too deep eventually became their own kind of trap. He let more through than he had during the last evaluation. Not everything. Not the golden flame that lived somewhere deeper inside him, still carefully hidden behind layers even he didn't fully understand yet. But enough. Enough to matter. Enough that pretending otherwise would only delay an inevitable reckoning rather than avoid it. The formation lit up brighter than anyone standing there expected, brighter than most of the fourth hall students had managed, brighter, in fact, than several third hall results that had drawn earlier murmurs of approval. Silence spread through the gathered students like frost across still water. Byrne's face went pale. Luna's eyes narrowed with sharp, focused interest rather than shock, as if a suspicion she'd been quietly nursing had just been confirmed exactly the way she expected. Rimmer didn't look surprised at all. His expression carried something closer to grim satisfaction, the particular look of a man whose instincts had finally been vindicated in front of witnesses who mattered. Glenn's composure didn't crack outwardly, but his eyes, for just a moment, held something unmistakable: recognition. The same recognition he'd carried alone in that training hall, the night the Sword of Justice had erupted into flame no one else witnessed. He said nothing immediately. He simply made a small gesture to one of his attendants, who produced a ledger and noted something down with visible care. The silence stretched a beat too long, before conversation slowly resumed among the students, quieter now, edged with confusion that hadn't existed in the crowd's collective assumptions just minutes earlier. Sylvia's son returned to his group without expression, aware that whatever careful concealment he'd maintained for months had just cracked open in front of the entire family. There would be no walking that back now. The evaluation concluded shortly after, students dismissed in the same order they'd arrived, murmurs following the fifth hall group the entire way back to their quarters. Byrne said nothing to him directly, his earlier hostility replaced by something that looked almost like caution now, wary in a way that hadn't existed before today. Rimmer caught up with him just before he reached the dormitory, his expression carrying weight that suggested he had more to say than time allowed at the moment. That, Rimmer said quietly, was overdue. Sylvia's son said nothing, waiting. Glenn doesn't gesture to attendance for unremarkable results, Rimmer continued. Whatever happens next, it won't stay quiet the way things have been. He nodded, understanding the warning for what it was. The path he'd been walking carefully in shadow had just stepped, at least partially, into light he couldn't fully control anymore. That evening, back in his room, he sat with the weight of the day settling slowly over him. The system window flickered once, delivering a modest notification confirming stat growth from the day's effort. Smaller now compared to the larger shifts that had defined recent weeks, but steady nonetheless. The bracelet on his wrist warmed as it often did in quiet moments, though the rage spirit's voice, when it finally spoke, carried a tone he hadn't heard from it before. Something almost like genuine interest, stripped temporarily of its usual hunger. The old man saw something today, it said. You felt it too. He didn't deny it. Glenn's expression had held recognition, brief, but unmistakable, the kind that only came from already suspecting something, and finally watching it confirmed. Whatever Glenn knew, or thought he knew, about the golden flame hidden inside the family's dismissed grandson, today's evaluation had likely moved that private suspicion several steps closer to becoming an open question, one that would eventually demand an answer neither of them could avoid indefinitely. Sleep came slowly that night, his mind circling through possibilities he couldn't fully control. Sylvia would hear about today's results soon enough, if she hadn't already through the manor's usual channels. Burns' family would ask uncomfortable questions about a boy they'd spent years dismissing as worthless. Rimmer's suspicions, no longer quiet, would likely draw attention from instructors above his own rank, and somewhere behind all of it, Glenn's careful, calculating silence continued, patient as stone, waiting for whatever came next, with the same unreadable composure he'd carried his entire life. 2 days later, that patience finally broke, though not in the way Sylvia's son expected. An attendant arrived at the Fifth Hall's quarters in the early evening, delivering a summons that made Rimmer's expression shift into something guarded the moment he read it. Sylvia's son was to report to Glenn's private study, alone, before the hour was finished. No explanation accompanied the summons. None was offered when he arrived either, the attendant simply guiding him through unfamiliar corridors of the manor's central wing before leaving him at a heavy wooden door and departing without another word. He knocked once. Glenn's voice, low and steady, told him to enter. The study was smaller than he expected, lined with shelves holding records that likely stretched back generations, the air carrying the particular quiet of a room built for thinking rather than socializing. Glenn sat behind a wide desk, a single lamp casting most of the room in shadow, his expression as unreadable as it had been during the evaluation 2 days earlier. "Sit," Glenn said simply. He sat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Glenn studied him with the same careful, measuring gaze he'd used during the talent ceremony, the same gaze that had lingered too long over a sword erupting into flame no one else had seen. "You've been training somewhere I haven't been shown," Glenn said eventually. Not a question, a statement, delivered with the flat certainty of a man who'd already gathered enough evidence to draw his own conclusions. Sylvia's son said nothing, weighing exactly how much truth this moment could safely hold. "The talent ceremony," Glenn continued, "showed a result that didn't match what I saw with my own eyes once the hall emptied." Something in Sylvia's son's chest went very still. He hadn't known, hadn't even suspected, that anyone had witnessed the sword's true reaction that day. The careful concealment he'd believed absolute suddenly felt considerably less secure. "I don't know what you're hiding," Glenn said, leaning back slightly, his tone carrying none of the coldness Sylvia's son had come to expect from him over the years. "I don't know why you've spent this long letting this family believe you're worth nothing, but I've watched enough talent pass through this house to recognize when someone is choosing to be underestimated rather than actually lacking ability." The silence that followed stretched long enough to feel dangerous. "I'm not asking you to explain everything tonight," Glenn continued finally, "but I am telling you this. Whatever you're building toward, you no longer need to build it entirely alone." It wasn't warmth, not exactly. Glenn's voice carried none of the softness Sylvia offered so easily, but it was something Sylvia's son hadn't expected to ever receive from this particular man. An offer, however guarded, of understanding instead of dismissal. He considered his next words carefully, aware that whatever he said now would shape how much this man chose to involve himself in whatever came next. "I'm not ready to explain everything," he said finally, echoing Glenn's own phrasing back at him deliberately, "but I intend for this family to understand exactly what they've been looking down on, eventually. On my terms, when the time is right." Something shifted behind Glenn's eyes, a flicker that might have been respect, might have been something closer to relief. He nodded once, slowly, seeming to accept the answer without pushing further. "See that it happens sooner rather than later," Glenn said. "Sylvia has waited long enough for this family to see her son clearly." The mention of his mother's name, spoken without cruelty for what felt like the first time since he'd been born into this house, landed harder than Sylvia's son expected. He hadn't realized how much weight he'd been carrying, believing Glenn's coldness towards Sylvia ran as deep as everyone else's. "You'll be transferred," Glenn added, before he could respond, "to the Fourth Hall, effective within the week. Officially, a result of your evaluation performance. Unofficially, consider it space to grow, without quite as many eyes watching every step." It wasn't the highest hall. It wasn't the recognition either of them likely wanted eventually. But it was movement, real and undeniable. The first tangible shift in status since Sylvia's son had arrived in this family, with nothing but a curse and a secret nobody believed. He left the study that night with more questions than answers, but for the first time since his reincarnation, something that felt distinctly like an ally sat somewhere inside this house's cold, calculating hierarchy. Sylvia met him in the hallway on his way back to the fifth hall's quarters, her expression tight with worry, until she saw his face and realized whatever had happened wasn't the disaster she'd feared. He told her only the parts he could safely share, a transfer to the fourth hall, nothing more specific than that. She hugged him tightly regardless, her relief evident even without the full story, and he let himself sink into that embrace a moment longer than strictly necessary, grateful for a warmth the curse could never quite erase. That night, alone again, the system window flickered once more, delivering a notification he hadn't expected so soon. A new milestone unlocked. Family recognition, Tier 1, it read, plainly, offering a modest boost to several stats alongside a note that further tiers would require deeper, more public demonstrations of ability. The bracelet on his wrist warmed one final time that night, the rage spirit's voice returning with something almost resembling amusement. Looks like the wager's about to get more interesting, it said. The old man's watching now. That changes the shape of everything ahead. He didn't disagree. Whatever quiet, careful concealment had defined his life since waking up in this cursed, fragile body was ending, piece by piece, exactly the way Rimmer had warned it eventually would. The fourth hall waited ahead, along with new instructors, new rivals, and undoubtedly new tests designed to measure exactly how much substance actually lived behind the modest display he'd allowed the family to witness so far. Somewhere beyond all of that, Darius still existed, unaware that the assassin he'd murdered years ago had found his way back into the world, growing quietly stronger inside a body nobody had ever expected to matter. The debt between them remained unpaid, but for the first time since dying on cold stone with a single shallow cut as his only mark of defiance, Sylvia's son allowed himself to believe that debt would eventually be collected in full. He fell asleep that night, with the bracelet still warm against his wrist, the curse still cold beneath his skin, and something new settling steadily in his chest that hadn't existed there before. Something close, cautiously, to hope.